Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. As always, viewer discretion is advised. June 15th, 2002. The Florida sun beat down on the entrance to Bat Colon Cave as 26-year-old Mark Orr adjusted his diving mask. He and three friends had traveled to Florida's Panhandle region, specifically to explore underwater caves. The crystal-clear springs and extensive cave systems were legendary among divers. But Mark and his friends were making a fatal mistake. All four divers were certified open-water divers. They had completed basic scuba training and were comfortable diving in oceans, lakes, and quarries. But cave diving is an entirely different world, one that requires specialized training, equipment, and certification. Cave diving statistics are terrifying. Since 1960, nearly 500 divers had been reported missing in underwater caves across Florida, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Of those 500, only 3 had ever been found alive till this incident. The group stood at the cave entrance, excited and completely unaware of the danger they were about to face. They had basic scuba gear: tanks, regulators, masks, and fins. What they didn't have was cave diving equipment like redundant air systems, specialized lights, and proper guideline reels. They did bring one rope to use as a guideline, a single cord they planned to follow back to the entrance. In proper cave diving, this guideline is sacred. It's the umbilical cord connecting divers to the surface and survival. Losing it means almost certain death. The water at the cave entrance was impossibly clear. Visibility extended for dozens of feet, several meters, making the underwater world seem safe and inviting. The limestone formations created a cathedral-like space filled with shafts of sunlight. Mark took a deep breath and descended into the water. The first few minutes were magical. The cave opened into a large chamber with stunning rock formations. The temperature was a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius, kept constant by the natural spring system. But as the four divers moved deeper into the cave, the environment began to change. The passages became narrower. The natural light from the entrance faded to black. Now, they were completely dependent on their flashlights to see. That's when disaster struck. In cave diving, the greatest danger isn't running out of air or equipment failure. It's something far simpler and far more terrifying: silt. The floor of underwater caves is covered with fine sediment that has accumulated over thousands of years. This silt is so fine that it can remain suspended in water for hours. When disturbed by divers' fins or movements, it creates what cave divers call a silt out, a condition where visibility drops to 0 in seconds. One of the divers accidentally kicked the cave floor. A cloud of silt exploded upward like an underwater dust storm. Within seconds, the crystal-clear water turned into a brown soup, where visibility was measured in inches rather than feet. Panic set in immediately. Mark couldn't see his hand in front of his face. He couldn't see his fellow divers. Most critically, he couldn't see the rope guideline that was supposed to lead them back to safety. In zero visibility, underwater, deep inside a cave system, disorientation is instantaneous. Up feels like down. Left feels like right. The human brain simply isn't designed to function without visual reference points. Mark reached out blindly, trying to find the rope or his diving partners. His hands found only rock walls and water. His air consumption skyrocketed as panic drove his breathing rate higher and higher. Cave diving training teaches specific protocols for silt outs. Divers are trained to remain calm, feel for the guideline, and follow it back to safety using touch alone. But Mark had no such training. He was operating on instinct and fear. He swam blindly through the darkness, burning through his air supply at an alarming rate. His tank gauge was dropping rapidly. In normal diving conditions, a tank might last 45 to 60 minutes. In panic conditions, that same tank could be empty in 15 minutes. Mark's gloved hands scraped against limestone walls as he searched desperately for the way out. Every passage felt identical in the darkness. He had no idea if he was swimming deeper into the cave system or toward the entrance. Then he remembered something. Earlier in the dive, before the silt out, they had passed through a large chamber with an air pocket at the top, a place where the cave ceiling rose above the water level, creating a breathing space. With his air gauge approaching zero, Mark made a desperate gamble. He stopped swimming horizontally and instead kicked upward, hoping to find that air pocket. His head broke the surface just as his regulator delivered its last breath of compressed air. Mark gasped in the cave air, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He was alive, but his situation was still desperate. He used his failing flashlight to survey his surroundings. He was in an air pocket roughly 10 feet, 3 meters wide, with a small ledge above the waterline. Mark hauled himself onto the ledge, his muscles shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. His diving equipment felt impossibly heavy. The cave air was humid and stale, but it was breathable. Now came the worst part, the waiting. Mark had no idea if his fellow divers had made it out. He didn't know if anyone above ground even knew there was a problem. He was alone in absolute darkness deep inside an underwater cave with no air supply and no way to signal for help. The silence was overwhelming. In the ocean, there are always sounds, waves, marine life, the constant background noise of water movement. But in the cave air pocket, there was nothing. Just Mark's breathing and the occasional drip of water. He prayed. What else could he do? He asked for rescue, for forgiveness for his stupidity, for another chance. Then, exhausted from the ordeal, Mark fell asleep leaning on the cold limestone ledge, half submerged in water. Above ground, Mark's diving partners had managed to escape the cave. They emerged confused and panicked, realizing that Mark was still missing somewhere in the underwater system. They immediately called for help. The call went out to Scott Hunsucker, a certified cave diving instructor with years of experience in Florida's treacherous underwater caves. When Hunsucker received the call about a missing diver in Bat Colon Cave, he prepared for a body recovery mission. The statistics were clear. When untrained divers go missing in underwater caves, they don't come back alive. Hunsucker had participated in dozens of these recoveries over the years. It was always the same story. Overconfident divers with inadequate training making fatal mistakes. 6 hours after Mark had entered the cave, Hunsucker descended into the water, fully expecting to find a corpse. He navigated the cave system with the casual expertise of someone who had made hundreds of cave dives. He carried redundant air systems, multiple powerful lights, and proper guidelines. He knew exactly where to search based on the description Mark's partners had provided. When Hunsucker reached the large chamber with the air pocket, he surfaced cautiously, his light cutting through the darkness. And there was Mark Orr, alive, leaning on a ledge in his dive gear. For a moment, both men stared at each other in disbelief. Hunsucker had been certain he was recovering a body. Mark had been certain he was going to die in that cave. After a brief greeting and a quick assessment of Mark's condition, Hunsucker gave him a spare regulator connected to his redundant air system. Then, using proper cave diving techniques and following a guideline, Hunsucker led Mark out of the cave system. They emerged into Florida sunshine to the cheers of emergency responders who had gathered at the cave entrance. Mark was exhausted, hypothermic, and traumatized, but alive. The rescue made international news. Mark Orr became only the 4th person in over 40 years to be rescued alive from an underwater cave after being reported missing. Out of nearly 500 missing divers since 1960, only 4 had survived. The odds had been 496 to 4 against him. Mark's survival came down to a combination of luck and a single decision. The luck was finding that air pocket before his tank ran empty. The decision was to stay put and wait for rescue rather than attempting to swim out in zero visibility with no air supply. The incident became a cautionary tale in the cave diving community. It demonstrated why cave diving certification exists and why the rules are so strict. Those rules aren't meant to limit fun. They're written in the blood of the 496 divers who didn't make it out. Mark Orr had entered Bat Colon Cave as an overconfident recreational diver. He emerged as living proof of why proper training and respect for the underwater environment aren't optional. They're the difference between life and death. In March 27, 1982, the Sparta Mountains of northern New Jersey rose against a gray spring sky as Sergeant Donald Weltner prepared for what should have been a routine Boy Scout expedition. At 48 years old, Weltner was a 22-year veteran of the New Jersey State Police and an experienced spelunker who had explored dozens of cave systems throughout the region. Today, he was taking 12 Boy Scouts, including his own two sons, Christopher and Roger, aged 12 and 14, into Crooked Swamp Cave, New Jersey's longest cave system. Another scoutmaster named Jim Ewing was also along to help supervise the large group of boys. Weltner had led similar expeditions before, without incident. He knew caves, he understood their dangers, he was trained, experienced, and careful. But caves don't care about experience or caution. They only care about physics and geology. The expedition was going well as the group made their way through the known passages of the cave system. The boys were probably having the time of their lives, exploring the underground world with their flashlights and experiencing the unique thrill that comes from being deep underground in a natural cave formation. At some point during the expedition, Weltner noticed an uncharted passage, a section of the cave that hadn't been mapped or explored in any detail. These uncharted passages held a magnetic appeal for experienced ones like Weltner. The chance to explore a virgin cave, to see formations that no human had ever witnessed, was irresistible to those who loved the underground world. That afternoon, Weltner spotted one of these unexplored passages. It was a narrow opening, roughly 18 inches by 20 inches, 46 by 51 centimeters, tight, but seemed navigable for an experienced spelunker. Weltner made the decision to crawl into this uncharted passage to see where it led. This wasn't reckless behavior. He was an experienced explorer who understood cave safety and knew how to assess whether a passage was safe to explore. The opening appeared stable and navigable, and Weltner likely felt confident that he could safely investigate this unmapped section. What Weltner couldn't have known was that this particular passage contained a deadly trap, a natural stone mechanism that would turn his body into the key that locked itself tighter with every movement. He squeezed into the crevice. The passage angled slightly downward, requiring him to crawl on his stomach, pushing himself forward with his legs and pulling with his arms. This type of crawl is called a squeeze. It's one of the most dangerous types of cave passage because it severely limits a caver's ability to maneuver. If something goes wrong in a squeeze, rescue becomes exponentially more difficult. Weltner pushed deeper into the passage. Then his forward progress stopped. Something was blocking the way ahead. A large limestone boulder sat wedged in the narrow crevice. The logical decision would have been to back out immediately, but Weltner may have thought he could shift the boulder or find a way around it. He pushed against the rock. The boulder moved, but it didn't move forward or to the side. Instead, it shifted in a way that Weltner couldn't have predicted. The rock was acting as what engineers call a keystone, a structural element that, when disturbed, causes catastrophic changes in the surrounding system. It was a rock that was helping to hold other rocks in place. When this keystone shifted, it triggered a mechanical trap that no one could have predicted. As the boulder moved, the rock settled into a new position that allowed Weltner to move forward slightly. But when he tried to reverse direction and back out of the passage, the boulder pressed tighter against him. But here's what made this trap so diabolical. Forward movement loosened the pressure slightly, backward movement tightened it, and Weltner was now 17 feet, 5.2 meters underground, in a space so tight he could barely breathe, let alone maneuver. It was like a Chinese finger trap made of limestone. He was trapped. Weltner would have immediately understood the severity of his situation. He was an experienced caver who knew that getting stuck in a tight passage is one of the most dangerous things that can happen underground. He probably tried multiple times to work himself backward, only to feel the stone press tighter against him with each attempt. What made Weltner's situation even more tragic was that the pressure from the stone was causing him to bleed. Either a rock had fallen and struck his head when the keystone dislodged, or the constant pressure from the stone was causing trauma that led to bleeding. Whatever the cause, Weltner was losing blood in a position where he couldn't apply pressure to the wound or do anything to stop the bleeding. Weltner's two sons and Jim Ewing apparently tried desperately to rescue him themselves. They probably tried pulling on his legs, tried to manipulate the rocks around him, and attempted everything they could think of to free him from the stone trap. But the geometry of the situation made it impossible. Any pulling from behind would only make the stone press tighter against him. For several hours, the boys and Ewing worked to free Weltner before they finally made the difficult decision to leave him and get help. This must have been agonizing for Weltner's sons, leaving their father trapped and injured in a dark cave passage while they went for help. But it was the only option that gave him any chance of survival. When authorities were notified and rescue workers arrived at Crooked Swamp Cave, they quickly realized they were facing an extremely difficult and dangerous rescue operation. Weltner was trapped 17 feet underground in a narrow crevice, held in place by a stone that would only tighten if they tried to pull him out. They couldn't simply extract him the way he had entered. They would have to somehow remove or bypass the stone that was trapping him. In the first several hours after the rescue operation began, Weltner remained coherent and able to communicate with the rescue workers. He talked to them from his stone prison, probably trying to describe exactly how he was trapped and what had happened when the keystone dislodged. At one point, displaying the kind of composure that you'd expect from a 22-year veteran state trooper, Weltner even asked the rescue workers to tell his wife that he would be late arriving home. But as the hours passed, Weltner's condition deteriorated. The combination of being trapped in a confined space, the ongoing blood loss from his head injury, the cold temperature of the cave, and the psychological stress of his situation were all taking their toll on his body. At 2 a.m. on Sunday morning, roughly 12 hours after Weltner became trapped, rescue workers heard their last communication from him. Not words, but grunts, small sounds that indicated he was still alive, still fighting. Then silence. By Monday morning, State Police Superintendent Colonel Clinton Pagano grimly reported that they could detect no vital signs. But the rescue workers never stopped. They continued placing hot water bottles, continued drilling and blasting, continued hoping for a miracle. The site became a muddy disaster zone. Heavy equipment churned the ground into ankle-deep muck. Generators roared constantly, powering lights and tools. Dozens of rescuers worked in shifts, never stopping, never giving up. For 80 hours straight, they worked. 3.5 days of continuous effort to free one man from 17 feet of limestone and a boulder that acted like a mechanical trap. On Tuesday night, late, they finally broke through. But the victory was hollow. 20 minutes before his body was pulled free, Donald Weltner had been officially pronounced dead. Dr. Lucian Fletcher Jr. stated that Weltner had actually been dead for some time before the official pronouncement, probably since sometime Sunday, meaning he had been dead for roughly 2.5 days while the rescue effort continued. When they finally pulled Weltner's body free from the crevice, blood could be seen on the limestone boulder where his head had been resting. The extent of his head injury became clear. The stone trap that had held Weltner was fully revealed once his body was removed. The boulder had acted as a keystone. When Weltner pushed it, it shifted into a position that tightened like a mechanical vise whenever he tried to back out. Every instinctive attempt to reverse course only made the trap tighter. Forward movement loosened it slightly, but going forward meant going deeper into an unmapped passage with no exit. His head injury was brutal as well. Pagano also revealed that Weltner had lost a significant amount of blood, which accounted for his rapid decline. Whether the injury came from the initial rock fall when he became trapped, or from stones loosened during the rescue drilling and blasting was unclear. Either way, the blood loss had been catastrophic in an environment where medical intervention was impossible. Weltner's brother Carl, also a scout leader, stood silently in the mud as his brother's body was removed and placed in an ambulance. 60 miles away in Perrinville, Weltner's wife had maintained a tense vigil throughout the ordeal. When state troopers delivered the news of her husband's death, several officers stayed with her, offering what comfort they could to a woman who had lost her husband to the underground world he loved. Weltner's body was transported to Newton Memorial Hospital for autopsy. The cause of death would be officially recorded, adding one more statistic to the long list of caving fatalities that mark the sport's dangerous history.